is that we tend to think of autoimmune disease as being incredibly different to each other. So we're trying to compare multiple sclerosis to type 1 diabetes to rheumatoid arthritis. But in actual fact, the root cause of these diseases is incredibly similar. The difference between rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis, so one that affects the lining, the insulation of the brain, the oligodendrocytes, and one that affects the joints, the synovium within the joints, the only difference is that the immune attackers, the antibodies and cells like that, T cells and B cells, they just recognize a different barcode. They're basically exactly the same effectors. They're just reading a different barcode. And reading a different barcode means that they can attack an entirely different tissue. And this is why when we talk about autoimmune diseases, we talk about them in clusters. It's well known that if you've got one autoimmune disease, you're far more likely to have another autoimmune disease. They're like Pokemon. Once you got one, you got to get them all. So and while this can be quite depressing, you think, holy crap. And when I start testing patients, if they come in with Hashimotos and we say, oh, you've got antibodies against your pancreas and use a bit of antibody against your joints and so on and so forth. The wonderful thing is that the treatment for one is effectively and usually relatively effective for others. I think the best evidence comes from a study. They looked at people with celiac disease who went gluten-free, but then they still had problems. And they said maybe there's something else in their diet that's causing a similar reaction to the gluten. So they tested for cross-reactivity to gliadin, which is the reactive component in most parts of gluten. And what they actually found, that there was 3 components within dairy that were significantly problematic. Casein was by far the worst. And of all different food components or antigens, casein was the worst across all the food types they tested. But whey protein was also reactive to a degree, and that morphine type substance that we talked about. And there was a couple of other substances within the dairy that slipped my mind. So it's not just casein, and people being in your field, my field, they say, oh, I need extra protein and they want to get on the whey protein. And we know from the evidence that's an excellent whey. It's an excellent mTOR stimulator. Whey protein's got a complete complement and is very effective. But for people with autoimmune issues, it might be problematic. So if we sort of circle back and the question that you said, when we see some people whose cholesterol goes very high, one of the most common dietary causes I see is dairy driving that. And the first thing I have my patients do is to strictly eliminate dairy from their diet. And it breaks a lot of hearts, but that includes butter. And for life, I'm not sure why people tend to think of butter, putting butter on a pedestal. That doesn't count. That comes from other milk, I guess. But it absolutely does include butter. People do react to butter. And I don't fully appreciate the reasoning why, but some people even react to ghee, which is theoretically had most of the proteins removed from it. I'm guessing there's still some of these chemicals and some proteins that are not completely removed even from ghee. So there's an autoimmune condition called eosinophilic esophagitis, which is sort of a prototypical autoimmune disease that affects the gastrointestinal tract. But it's very easy to study because we can just whack a camera down your mouth and have a look at the esophagus, and we can do biopsies and samples on it. So they've actually what we call histological remission of this disease, where they actually cut a bit of the tissue out, look at it under a microscope and say, oh, those inflammatory cells have disappeared. So they've actually, through empirical, basically trial and error, research found that there's 6 different food types that will predominantly trigger eosinophilic esophagitis. And the study which I refer most commonly to showed that when people simply eliminate those 6 foods from their diet with this proven disease, about 73% of them will induce and maintain a prolonged histological remission, which is pretty impressive. Those 6 foods, though, include things that carnivores commonly consume. So milk is there. So nuts and seeds is also there. And people often forget that coffee is a seed. Mm-hmm. Coffee will absolutely trigger those reactions. And the third one is fish and seafood, which really blows a lot of people's minds. Now, I actually personally add pork to that list as well for a lot of people. So we talked about cross-reactivity before, and there's a lot of people with cat dander allergies and animal danders. And for some reason, there seems to be something about pork meat that leads to a cross-reaction with some of the animal danders. If I'm noticing people are still particularly inflamed, even on a carnivore-style diet, the things that we'll look at in terms of hierarchy will be dairy, coffee, fish, seafood, also eggs. I forgot to add eggs to the list. And this is another one that people are often very surprised about.